Okay, now we know that Lyndon Johnson has full authority to do pretty much whatever he wants to do concerning this conflict in Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which I mentioned yesterday, I believe to be the worst piece of legislation this country has ever passed. Anyway, with that said, we are going to talk about American and South Vietnamese strategy in the war prior to any ground troops being sent. Okay? We keep in mind when we talk about this, we still haven't sent any ground troops in. Okay? So we're going to talk about American and South Vietnamese strategy in the war. What are we going to do to try to get this thing to end before we have to do what? Send in ground troops. So you got to give Johnson a little bit of credit. They're going to try to do something here to avoid that. Well, basically what the American and South Vietnamese strategy in the Vietnam War was prior to bringing in ground troops was to bomb the hell out of North Vietnam. Bomb them into submission. And there's two reasons why we would drop an enormous amount of bombs on the country of North Vietnam to try to avoid bringing in ground troops. Now obviously we all know we ended up bringing in ground troops, right? But that didn't mean we quit the bombing, but this was our initial thought process. So what would be the obvious reason, Nick, that you would bomb somebody? Just bomb them, bomb them, bomb them. What would be the purpose of doing that, bombing the country of North Vietnam? If I continually punch you in the face, what's eventually going to happen? What's that? Well, you're at the second part. He's close. But I'm going to damage you, right? I'm going to damage you and damage you and damage you and damage you until you think, man, I can't take any more of this, so I'm going to negotiate with you on so you'll quit hitting me in the face. So the idea was to bomb them and bomb them and bomb them and bomb them, destroying their country to the point they would come to the negotiation table and we would say to them, hey, this idea you have about taking South Vietnam into communist control is a bad idea. How about if you back off and just do your own thing like we did in Korea? That was the initial strategy. We're just going to bomb you into submission. Okay? And hopefully, during that time, you'll come to your senses and want to negotiate. Didn't work, quite frankly, but that was the philosophy. Now, we also got a little crazy with some chemicals during this time. And the first one was known as napalm. Okay? We used napalm on the country of North Vietnam. Anybody have any idea what napalm is made of? No. Chemicals and gasoline. And when you mix these certain chemicals and gasoline together, it would form almost like jelly or jam that you would get in a jar. And when you let it on fire, it would burn for about 10 minutes, and if it hits you, it would give you the most excruciating pain you can imagine, and usually resulted in death. You did not want to be hit with napalm. Napalm was a bad thing. Again, it was a toxic chemical that they mixed with gasoline that created kind of a jelly or jam-like substance that when you lit it on fire, it would stick to practically anything and burn for at least 10 minutes. And if you got it on you as a human being, the pain would be excruciating and most often would result in your death. Okay? So that's another thing that we used on the people of North Vietnam during this bombing siege to try to get them to come to the table. Another chemical we used was different. It was called Agent Orange. And what it was is it was also a toxic chemical, but it was a herbicide. It was a herbicide. It wasn't meant necessarily to damage people, although being subject to that or exposed to that could cause problems and still causes problems in veterans today that served in Vietnam with their physical health and mental health. But the idea behind Agent Orange, it was a herbicide. What does a herbicide do? Kills plants. And there was two reasons why they wanted to kill foliage in North Vietnam. One is they didn't want the North Vietnamese soldiers to have any food supply. So by dropping this Agent Orange in on North Vietnam, it would kill their food supply and also ruin what that they would need? Well, we'll get to that. Water. It would ruin the water supply and the food supply. So it would cut off that opportunity for those particular soldiers. The second reason Rhiannon alluded to is that this was a weird war because they didn't fight like they were supposed to. They'd be in the North Vietnamese, and there was so much cover in North Vietnam, we could never see where they were at. And we'll get into this. They were kind of into hit and run warfare, and they would hit you and then slide into the protection of the jungles. So this Agent Orange was shot across North Vietnam to kill the foliage, so it would expose where the enemy was. It's like kind of like Roundup, so to speak. Okay? And so it would kill the foliage, all foliage, and expose the enemy. Now the problem with that is Vietnam veterans who were exposed to a lot of Agent Orange eventually, and still do, have lots of health issues because of that. And we have not done, I don't think, a very good job of helping those people as much as we should, but that's what's happened. Okay? So we tried to kind of beat negotiation out of them early. But obviously it's not going to work, and we're going to end up sending in ground troops. So, with that said, what was the North Vietnamese strategy in the war? How are they going to fight this war? Now, they were somewhat similar to the Confederates in the Civil War. They fought what type of war at first? But what type? Did they go on the offensive? No, they fought kind of a defensive war at start. Now, they're eventually going to get a little more offensive, but they're fighting more of a defensive war. And did the soldiers in the Civil War fight fair, so to speak, in a lot of battles against the Union? No, remember they hid behind rocks and trees and stuff, sometimes while the Union marched right into them. They used some guerrilla tactics, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, you need to know who we're up against, okay? These North Vietnamese soldiers that fought so hard in the Vietnam War were guerrillas, and they used guerrilla tactics, but they were best known as the Viet Cong. That's what we called these North Vietnamese soldiers in the Vietnam War. We called them the Viet Cong. And American soldiers even shortened that more to just call them VC. There's 37 VC over there in that village. So VC meant Viet Cong, and Viet Cong were simply North Vietnamese soldiers. And they didn't use very fair tactics. Matter of fact, they also referred to the VC, and I'm not sure why, as Charlie. Called him Charlie. I think it was a racist term, but anyway, Charlie. So VC or Charlie. But they were Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers. And they didn't fight by the rules. They used guerrilla tactics, and they used terrorism. That was their game in the Vietnam War. Guerrilla tactics and terrorism. We've talked about guerrilla tactics. That's your hit and run warfare. Did I tell you a story about, I told you the Taco John story, didn't I? Years ago, where I went into Taco John's in Billings, and this great big guy was going to beat on, remember? Hit and run, boom, 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 boom. Okay? That's what they did. And they avoided large-scale fighting. They did not want to fight at a large scale. They wanted to fight very, very sneakily. Hit you in the mouth, hide. Hit you in the mouth, hide. Kill as many as we could, hide. Okay? Now, the part that was very difficult was their use of terrorism. And I'm going to give you 5 kind of interesting examples of what these Viet Cong would do and go out of their way to try to kill any American personnel or soldiers. What's a country marketplace? What do you know that as? We have one here every Saturday when the weather gets good. What is that? Farmer's market. What is that? Local selling cakes and tacos and, well, when you're in South Vietnam, there isn't a Blair's. Everybody brings their stuff to the country marketplace and they sell it. Well, the first example of terrorism is these, and I'm not being racist here, but how would you tell someone from South Vietnam to someone from North Vietnam? They look exactly the same because they're the same country. It's not like the United States, a nation of immigrants. They're all Vietnamese. Okay? If you're white there, you stick out like a sore thumb. You can't tell the difference. So it would not be difficult for a North Vietnamese or VC soldier to come in not in uniform and place a bomb in the middle of a country marketplace, hoping when that went off, it would kill as many American personnel and GIs as possible, because they have to go there and shop. Would it kill some civilians and children? Sure, they didn't care. But that's what they did. So there's your first example, the planting of bombs in country marketplaces. Now, Charles, if you were a GI in Vietnam and you had a little R&R, some time off in Saigon, where might you go in the evening? Where might you go in the evening to relax, take off some tension?
My bar.
That a boy. You'd go to a local bar or nightclub. Well, what better place to kill American GIs and military personnel than to put bombs in nightclubs and bars? Anybody seen the movie Good Morning Vietnam? Nobody? Have you? You remember they did that in the movie? Don't you remember Cronauer was in there and his North Vietnamese buddy that he thought was South set the bomb in there and got him out of there just in time. Remember that? That's when they started to catch on that his buddy was dirty, so to speak, okay? That's a pretty good movie, actually, if you want to know what's going on there. So they planted bombs in bars and nightclubs. Busiest cities. It'd be really pretty easy to put a few bombs in a busy city, right, on timers. Blow up. Then any luck at all, you'll kill American GIs or personnel because that's where they hang out when they're on leave. These are non-battle tactics. You see what I'm saying? We're going to kill you in battle, and then we're going to kill you when you're on leave too. Now this is a sad one, but it's true. So Andy, you're a married soldier in Vietnam. You got a young wife at home and a couple children. You haven't seen them in about 8 months. You're sitting at the country marketplace, right? Little 3-year-old, cute little South Vietnamese child walks up to you. What are you going to do? What would you do you think? Talk to him. Maybe put him on your lap, pick him up, take him over and buy him an ice cream. Bombs on babies. North Vietnamese guerrillas put bombs on children. And when American GIs were missing their families at home, would take time to play with the child or put them on their lap or whatever, boom. Crazy stuff. This is even the worst one. It's a little off color, but it's true. Lots of times GIs would not take any identification with them into battle. Or lots of times they didn't, want any identification on if they were killed, because the Viet Cong would remove parts of their anatomy, find an address, mail them back to the families. Can you imagine that? Would you want your family to receive something like that? No. And they did that. Remove parts of your body, the bad parts your family shouldn't really want to see the least. So, gruesome acts such as sending body parts of American soldiers back home after they were either killed or captured. Often, to be quite blunt, the genital part of the soldier. These people were ruthless. They were mad. They didn't want you in their country, did they? They're going to do anything they could to get you back home and leave us alone. It didn't care what the rules of war were, they were going to do it. Now, so we've come to the conclusion, haven't we, kiddos, that we're not going to be able to win this thing without ground troops, right? We either get out or send in ground troops. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is American commitment in the Vietnam War. And all I'm going to do is give you statistic after statistic on how our ground troops increased from the time Johnson took over the war until he goes out of office. Because does this war end during the Johnson presidency? No, it goes clear to the Nixon presidency. Okay, and that into the 70s. Okay? One of the problems with the American commitment in Vietnam as far as ground troops is we couldn't keep it a secret. Why couldn't we keep it a secret? Why couldn't we keep what? Well, why couldn't we keep it a secret from the American public how many troops we had there?
Because of the media.
Yeah, what do we have? This is going to be the first what war? Television war. First time a war is going to be broadcast on television. Nightly news every night going to give you reports back from Vietnam. Right? Body bags coming home. Number of soldiers killed today. Number of soldiers wounded today. And everybody's going to be fixated on that and watching it every single night. It's the first television war in American history. Now, I'm going to give you something I want you to listen to, and you can write it down in your notes, paraphrase it any way you want in your notes. But in late October of 1964, this is what President Johnson stated about sending ground troops to Vietnam. Okay, late October 1964, this is what Lyndon Johnson said publicly about sending ground troops to Vietnam. And again, you paraphrase however you want. We won't ask you for the direct quote. He said late in October 1964, quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." This is what he said in late October 1964 concerning ground troops. "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." What's he saying? It's not his intention to send ground troops, is it? Late October 1964. Because he's counting on what? Bombing. Very good. He's counting on the bombing, right, to make this work. Not going to happen. Okay, here's a question for you from yesterday's lecture. How many American military advisors were in Vietnam prior to Johnson taking over the presidency? 16,000. By January of 1965, that number increased to 17,000. So how many did Johnson send in? About 1,000. So there are 17,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam serving as advisors in January of 1965. So are there any troops there yet? No. Well, in February of 1965, the Viet Cong attack a United States military unit in South Vietnam, and they kill 7 of these American military advisors, and they wound about 100 more. February of 1965, the Viet Cong attack the United States military base, and in that attack they killed 7 of these American military advisors and wound about 100 more. Okay, that's February of 1965. What does President Johnson do, Leighton, to retaliate for that? He hasn't sent any yet. He sends in the what? First American troops to Vietnam, United States Marines. So to retaliate for this attack in February of 1965, President Johnson now will send the first combat troops to Vietnam, United States Marines. We now have troops in Vietnam. That was February, right? By April 1st of the same year, which is just a month later or so, there are 28,000 American combat troops in Vietnam. By April 1st of 1965, that has increased now to 28,000. Well, the war continues, and again, I'm not going to give you specific battles in this war and cover it in detail because it would take me forever. It's very confusing. So we're just going to give you, because of what's happening there, the increases. By the end of 1965, we're still talking about the same year. By the end of 1965, there are 190,000 combat troops in Vietnam and about 2,500 casualties, American casualties. So by the end of 1965, you're looking at about 190,000 soldiers there and about 2,500 casualties. That is going to be killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Okay? That's by the end of 65. So we'll just go year by year for a bit here. By the end of 66, because of the events in Vietnam and how it's going, 400,000 combat troops and about 33,000 casualties. At the end of 1966, that number has increased to 400,000, with about 33,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, captured, or missing. About the end of 67, over 500,000 American soldiers and over 100,000 American casualties. October 1964, we're not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. Right? End of 67, 500,000 troops, 100,000 casualties. Now, just to let you know, by the end of 1967, for the first time in American history, what are American citizens starting to do? Well, not so much, that's a good point, not so much protest yet, but question our involvement. Have we ever been questioned, anybody question our involvement in World War I? World War II, Korea? No. But for the first time in American history, by the end of 1967, Americans began to question for the first time the American military and the president. Which takes us really right into the next subtopic, because I'm going to give you 6 reasons why they had a good right, probably, to start to question. And that's 1967, a tough year for the United States in Vietnam. 1967, a tough year for the United States in Vietnam. And I'm going to give you 6 reasons why it was not only a tough year, but why people began to question our efforts in Vietnam. I think you'll be a little surprised by some of this. And all of these are by the end of 1967, these statistics. And I think you'll understand why people were frustrated. By the end of number 1, by the end of 1967, more than 14,000 American soldiers had been killed. How many names are on that wall? Anybody know? About 58,000. Well, by the end of 67, 14,000 were already ready to be put on. Although that didn't happen until many years later, right? But still, there were 14,000 killed by the end of 1967. And number 2, by the end of 1967,